Local Perspective. I'm Jerry Deshane, the Executive Director of the League of Wisconsin Municipalities. And today we're going to talk about the wheels coming off the wagon. Is the way Wisconsin finances local government broken? Or is it just bent a little bit, maybe under the strain? Very excited to have the guest with me today that I have. I'm with Rob Henkin. Rob is the president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum. Did I get it right?
You got it right.
And the reason I hesitated is because for a long time, 100 years, a long time?
104 years.
104 years, it was the Public Policy Forum, and Rob's work was centered around Milwaukee and southeast Wisconsin. But recently you've merged.
That is correct. So with the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance.
Another old and venerable research organization.
Yes, so WisTax, 85 years old, so just a puppy when compared to the Public Policy Forum. But no, seriously, a very rich, long tradition, Madison-based, nonpartisan policy research organization. Mm-hmm. So this is a marriage of two organizations that have had similar missions in terms of providing factual perspective, encouraging data-driven decision-making by local governments and school districts and state government throughout the state of Wisconsin.
And I think you'll understand, if you don't know Rob, you'll understand very quickly why I've invited him to talk about this issue, which is frankly, the way we fund local government in Wisconsin no longer makes any sense. But in order to set the stage for that, tell people about sort of the history of the Public Policy Forum and the Taxpayers Alliance for that matter. Where'd you come from? Why do you exist?
Yep. So let me start with the Public Policy Forum. We were created as part of a national movement called the Efficiency Movement. So this was during the Progressive Era when muckraking journalists first started to make people aware that there was some graft and corruption in particularly big city governments, New York City, Tammany Hall. Mm-hmm. And there was a movement across the country. It was actually effectuated by business leaders who said we need to form citizen-led research bureaus that can be another set of eyes and ears to watch over local government, to make sure that, first of all, they are free of graft and corruption, but perhaps even more important, to try to encourage greater efficiency, to try to instill principles of efficiency within the workings of local government. So there were about a half dozen cities that formed these research bureaus. Milwaukee was one of them. At the time, we were called the Citizens Governmental Research Bureau. And that was our birth. And over the years, I think we've morphed a little bit into being just as much a public policy think tank as a local government watchdog. I use the word watchdog with some hesitation because we really don't see ourselves as one of the entities that it's out there dumping on government and criticizing government. But we see ourselves, or the Public Policy Forum and now the Wisconsin Policy Forum, see ourselves more as seeing eye dogs, entities that are there to try to guide governments and to help governments make better decisions and to provide factual perspective and research that perhaps they don't have the capacity to do themselves, or in some cases that even if they did do the research themselves, people may not trust it coming from the government, but they may trust it more coming from an independent Citizens Research Bureau. And WisTax, Jerry, has really had a similar tradition formed in 1932. In that case, as the name Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance implies, a lot of concern over making sure that taxpayer dollars were being spent wisely and effectively throughout the state.
So in this day and age of fake news is overused, but frankly, there's a lot of research organizations out there that they have an agenda. What's your agenda? Do you lean right? Do you lean left? Which way do you lean, Rob?
We come straight down the middle.
Okay.
And that has been the tradition of the Public Policy Forum for 104 years. I think the organization would not still be in business if we had ever strayed from the credibility that we've achieved through a lot of hard work. And here too, Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, very similar. That we are not driven by either right of center or left of center ideology. If we advocate for anything, it is for efficient and effective government. And to us, that's not a political issue. That's something that people from the left and the right should agree that again, taxpayer resources, given their scarcity, need to be spent effectively and efficiently.
Which, with that as background, I think that helps you folks understand why my eyebrows or what's left of my eyebrows sort of shot up when I read an article, a report that you did about the city of Milwaukee's financial structure. And if you're curious, there's a summary of it in this month's issue, the January issue of the Municipality Magazine. And the headline says it all. It's busted. It's broke, not broke in the financial sense, but broke in the functioning sense. Rob, what's wrong with the way the city of Milwaukee is financed?
So the Public Policy Forum has for, again, a century been studying, overseeing, weighing in on the finances of the city of Milwaukee. We've done a couple of very deep dive into the city's fiscal condition. We did one in 2009 and then followed that up with a report in 2016. And when you look at the fundamental problems facing the city of Milwaukee government, the bottom line element here is that they do not have revenue streams that are increasing at the rate of inflation. So we could talk all day, Jerry, about government's need for new revenue and whether there should be an expectation that governments from year to year will see an increase in revenue. But we think a pretty important standard that, again, people from all political stripes ought to be able to agree on is that just like any business out there, a local government's revenue streams ought to be able to grow roughly at the pace of inflation. When you think about what are the biggest areas of spending in municipal governments, obviously it's personnel. And there ought to be an expectation that government workers should be entitled to inflation-based pay increases, for example. In terms of health care and other fringe benefits, those often increase at higher than the rate of inflation. But when we looked historically at the major revenue streams supporting city government in Milwaukee, and those are the property tax and state shared revenues, we have seen an inability for those major streams, due to a variety of reasons, to grow roughly at the pace of inflation. And you can accommodate that in various ways. It doesn't mean that your expenditures have to grow every year at the rate of inflation. What can you do to make yourself more efficient? What can you do to make some prioritization type choices and decide that maybe there are certain services that you can't deliver at the same level or deliver at all much as you used to? But if year after year after year after year, you're failing to see that type of revenue growth, that's going to create service level problems. Mm-hmm. And again, it's choices. And for those of us who feel like taxes are too high, and so that to the extent that we have these service level issues, that we should err on the side of reducing services versus trying to increase revenues, that's again a conversation we can have. But in the case of the city of Milwaukee, you can't even get to that conversation because the restrictions that are in place on the revenue streams are such that city leaders don't have the ability to have that conversation.
So it's tough everywhere. I mean, municipalities are under fiscal constraints everywhere. But your study, you looked at Milwaukee as it relates to her peers. You looked at somewhat 30 different cities.
39.
Does Milwaukee fall in the middle of those peers in terms of revenue options, and it's, whether it's failing, doing okay? Where are they?
So what we did, Jerry, was we took a look at every city across the United States with a population between 300,000 and 1 million. We had to exclude a handful where there's a combined city-county government, or there's a few cities where the city levies property taxes for the school district. So we excluded those. And what you end up with is this set of 39 cities. Okay. Remarkably, we found that Milwaukee is the only one of those 39 that is limited in terms of its local, comprehensive local taxation options, limited solely to the property tax.
You said unique, as in
we are the only one of those 39 that does not have the ability to implement either a general sales tax on a municipal basis or a selective sales tax. So there are some cities that selectively have sales taxes on items like restaurant and bar purchases, on parking, on other selective items. Hotel, motel rooms is another example. We essentially have all of our local revenue eggs in one basket, which is the property tax. And that's not just the city of Milwaukee. That's the way we have set up the financial structure in the state of Wisconsin.
And I want to get to what this harbors or augurs or whatever for other cities, but let's talk about Milwaukee for a while and their peers.
So the reason it's a particularly striking issue for Milwaukee is that there are other states. So let's talk for just a moment about this structure that state government has set up. We have a structure here in the state of Wisconsin where we very deliberately have been quite restrictive in terms of how we allow local governments to raise revenues. Mm-hmm. In turn, we are very generous in terms of the amount of state revenue that supports municipalities and county governments. We have a robust shared revenue program. Now, we're going to get into the fact that, again, while comparatively speaking, I can say robust, because we have found that we are actually number 3 of those 39 in terms of the percentage of Milwaukee's budget that is coming from state revenue. The problem is that while it's robust, it has not increased for many, many, many years. And so that's part of the problem. Right. But so this is our structure. We're saying to our local governments, we're going to ensure that we are giving you shared revenue payments to help support your operations. In turn, and those are essentially being generated by state income taxes and state sales taxes, but we are not going to allow you to do local income taxes or local sales taxes. And so for better or for worse, and we'll get into this, that's the structure we've set up. We have found that it is not unique for state governments to be restrictive in terms of what they allow their local governments to do in terms of raising revenue. Right. But what we have also found is that across the country, exceptions are made for the large population centers, the largest cities. Now, why is that? Is it because state legislatures throughout the country like their large cities better than their smaller communities? No. It's simple recognition of the fact that when we think of the users of municipal services and we think about large cities like Milwaukee, Milwaukee has tens of thousands of non-resident commuters who are coming to work in the city of Milwaukee every day, who don't live in the city of Milwaukee, who, because there's not a local sales tax or a local income tax, are not paying a dime to support the city infrastructure that they use, from roads to public safety services, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Because large cities tend to be populated during the weekday by tens of thousands of non-residents, because large cities tend to have entertainment and tourism attractions and sports arenas that are, again, drawing people to come and use city services from outside of city boundaries. The notion that we are going to have the municipal finance structure based on residency, based on essentially property taxes and local service charges, that's where it doesn't make sense ostensibly, and that's why in other states exceptions have been made for large cities. In the state of Missouri, there's lots of restrictions, but Kansas City and St. Louis both have been granted the ability to have local sales and local income taxes because of the recognition that we want to share the burden, so to speak, mm-hmm. of paying for municipal services, not just to the resident population, but to the full spectrum of individuals who are actually consuming city services every day.
I'm talking to Rob Henkin. Rob is the president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum and probably Wisconsin's, if not the leading expert on local government finance, at least within the top 3 or 4. You'd fit around a coffee table, I suspect. Okay, Rob, you say the city of Milwaukee's finance system is broken. First question is that a theoretical thing or there are real consequences? I mean, they recently laid off several dozen police officers and firefighters, didn't they?
They did. So I think we really started to see it's sort of the canary in the coal mine in terms of what the city is now facing. So, Jerry, this is not a new problem. The city's shared revenue payment in nominal terms, not adjusting for inflation, in nominal terms, remarkably, in 2016, the city's intergovernmental revenue, which is the single largest revenue source in its budget, was the same $263 million as it was 20 years earlier.
It hasn't changed a dime.
Hasn't changed a dime. If you had adjusted for inflation, that $260 million would be about $415 million.
But along the way, Wisconsin's economy grew, income tax collections grew, sales tax collections grew. But what's happened is the shared has fallen out of shared revenue.
Exactly. So this notion of sharing, that as the state is going to see its collection of these forms of taxes grow, that some portion of that growth would be shared with local governments. In the case of the city of Milwaukee, that simply hasn't occurred. Now, in fairness, we did have Wisconsin Act 10. So one of the ways that city government was able to make ends meet was city government did avail itself of the flexibility under Wisconsin Act 10 to make comprehensive changes to its healthcare benefits and to save lots and lots of money in terms of healthcare. So that's one reason that we haven't seen, despite the fact that here we have this problem, these flat revenue streams, why haven't city services suffered more than they have? Well, the city has been able to do a lot of different things. Again, they've been able to restructure their healthcare benefits. They now get contributions in terms of their pension fund. First, they received them from the general employees, which was as a direct result of Act 10, but then they were able to negotiate pension contributions from public safety employees. They have really seen some very significant increases in service charges to try to make up for the lack of growth in shared revenue, also to make up for the fact that, of course, the property tax is capped. So whether city leaders wanted to increase the property tax at a pace that would make up for this flat growth of shared revenue or not, we know that they are limited in their ability to do so by property tax levy limits and by the state's expenditure restraint program. But finally, this year, back to your question, for the 2018 budget, it's catching up. It's been catching up for a while, and in this last budget, the city was forced to eliminate about 70 firefighter positions and about 24 police positions, because finally, another thing the city has been doing is it has prioritized public safety. So in trying to hold the line on cuts to public safety, other areas of city government have suffered, from public health to the Department of City Development. They have seen reductions in positions, libraries, etc. This was the first year where essentially city leaders said we can no longer afford, we can't hold the line anymore. The need to make up for this lack of revenue growth and to try to accommodate the growth in our fixed costs has reached the point that we can't spare public safety any longer, and so we've seen cuts. And so unless something gives here, this is probably a dynamic that we're going to continue to see, that with this restricted revenue growth, there are going to have to be expenditure reductions, which may translate into service level impacts across the broad range of city services.
Now let's take this conversation bigger to the rest of the state. And it's fortuitous, I think, that your organization has now changed its focus from the southeast corner to the whole state. Is what's happening in Milwaukee, I mean, first of all, that's a pretty big canary. Is what's happening in Milwaukee unique, or are we going to see that in all of our major cities and by extension, all of our villages and cities? They're all subject to the same levy limits. They're all subject to shared revenue, or I should say revenue without shared. Is this a problem we will see throughout the state?
So it's a tough question to answer. I'll answer it in very general terms. So first of all, I mean, ideally, you need to look at every individual municipality. You need to look at the extent to which they have healthy reserves, the extent to which they're getting growth in new construction, which gives them more leeway to increase property taxes. Obviously, larger cities are far more dependent on state shared revenue than smaller municipalities. Therefore, the lack of growth in the shared revenue program is going to hurt those larger cities more.
Well, and if I can interrupt you, Janesville just convinced the legislature to give it, I won't call it a bailout, but a kind of a unique $500,000 a year bonus payment under shared revenue, because they were the city that was sort of caught on the short end of the stick when the shared revenue formula was frozen 20 years ago. So there's another canary that, if not dead, is at least swaying on the vine.
Right, and so I think what we're seeing now on a more general, broader stage, and it's a point that we actually made in the wake of the adoption of Act 10, and not to get into whether Act 10 was good or bad public policy, but I don't think there's any question that strictly from a local government finance perspective, Act 10 did provide benefits initially to municipal governments. That the cuts that year in shared revenue payments were offset by the ability to do things on the healthcare and pension side that municipal governments had previously not been able to do. The question at that time was, though, but what's going to happen going forward? So you can make those adjustments to your healthcare benefits. You can now start collecting the cost-sharing payments from your employees, from your non-public safety employees, for a share of the employer pension contributions to the WRS, or in the case of the city of Milwaukee, to its own pension fund. So you can get those initial savings. But going forward, if shared revenue payments continue to remain flat, unless you're able to go out and reduce your healthcare and pension costs every year, then eventually that's going to start to take its toll. And I think, generally speaking, that's what is starting to happen here, not just in the city of Milwaukee, but in other municipal governments. It's getting tougher and tougher to accommodate those flat shared revenue payments by increasing property taxes or making changes to benefits, because on the benefit side, at some point, you have to be concerned about your workforce and your ability to attract and retain employees.
In this day and age, yeah.
In this day and age. And obviously there are limitations to how much you want to raise property taxes every year, even if you can under the property tax levy limits. And so ultimately your fixed costs, the need for growth in your fixed costs is exceeding the capacity of your revenue streams to meet that need, and therefore you're left with no option but to cut. And so again, and that's not to say that cutting shouldn't be the priority over somehow trying to look at for new revenues. I think a very important part of this conversation is not just about do municipal governments need more revenue, it's also about whether this structure is making sense for local economies. Having all of this reliance on property taxes versus having a more balanced local revenue portfolio that maybe would use a mix of different forms of local taxation and that could potentially allow municipal governments to lower property taxes, that's the type of conversation that we think needs to occur.
And in some quarters, that conversation is starting. The Assembly Ways and Means Committee, under Chairperson John Mako from the Green Bay area, is looking at restructure and looking at reform. And I want to ask you two questions. First of all, I want to ask you, are you looking at other cities in Wisconsin to see if the Milwaukee problem is in fact occurring in other places? And then the second question I want to ask you is, what should the legislature use as a meter to decide what's a good tax structure? But let's start with the easier question first. Are you taking the Milwaukee research anywhere else in Wisconsin?
Yep, so coincidentally, yes. We have a project ongoing right now where we are taking a deep dive into the city of Racine.
Okay.
And its financial
very
structure.
Timely.
And it's very timely. We, believe it or not, this idea originated even before Foxconn. But now we sort of have the double reason to look at this. Racine is another big city with high rates of poverty, with a declining property tax base. And so understanding the financial challenges that the city of Racine is facing, comparing those to Milwaukee's challenges, will give us another layer of analysis as to whether this is, again, tied back to a revenue structure that was created by state government 100 years ago, or whether there are other factors going on. But also in light of Foxconn, in light of the service demands, the municipal service demands that are likely to occur in all of the communities surrounding that development, it is timely to look at that. So we hope to come out with that report sometime in the spring.
Well, we'll look forward to that. And I imagine if there's access to that, we will make that available in our magazine, probably on our website as well. Okay, but now the tough question, or I should say, this is your no holds barred, the Rob Henkin tax system. What is the ideal tax? What is the ideal system to fund local government? And if there is no such thing, how do you measure it? How do you decide if something is a good or a bad fit?
Yep. It's a tough question because I think, again, the starting point, you do need to consider the distinctions between different regions and different municipalities. So again, in terms of the city of Milwaukee, the lens through which we are looking at this that I think is most compelling is not even that city government is struggling to maintain service levels, and maintaining public safety service levels is obviously a critical thing to do.
That sort of matters.
It sort of matters, but it's a fairness issue. It's an issue where you have, again, all of these different users of municipal services, but only a subset of those users, the residents, is being asked to pay for them. Mm-hmm. So you look at that, and you look at the ability of a city like Milwaukee, with all of the impressive growth that's going on downtown and all of the new entertainment that's coming in and so forth, that's looking to raise visitation. And you look at all of the people who will be coming to Milwaukee and consuming services, and you just say to yourself, well, it doesn't seem right to not tap into that for the sake of the local economy to help pay for municipal services. So putting in place some type of a sales tax, either general or selective sales taxes, in the city of Milwaukee, there's all sorts of fairness arguments and local economic reasons why that should be on the table. Smaller municipalities throughout the state, that might be a different conversation. Mm-hmm. And so I do think we need to consider that, and I do think here too we could learn from other states where there are different structures for different municipalities. But I think the bottom line is that when you think about a local government revenue portfolio, you should look at it like your own personal portfolio. And we all know that diversity tends to be good. Sure. And so again, this notion that we have all of our eggs in the property tax basket is something that needs to be looked at. And so looking at other types of service fees or sales tax type approaches across the state would appear to make sense to rebalance. And again, this isn't adding a layer of taxation above what we have necessarily. It's also thinking about, would we be better with better balance? And so would part of looking at sales taxes be looking at lowering property taxes and finding a better balance?
Okay. Particularly important in those areas, especially in Wisconsin, where we have a growing aging population, more and more reliant on a fixed income. So kind of wrapping up here, first question, is anyone from the legislature interested? Have they looked at your work? Have you talked to legislators about your work?
We have certainly begun to engage Milwaukee area legislators who are now very much aware. Again, it was a significant thing that this was the year that city government in Milwaukee had to make reductions in personnel on the fire and police side. And so we have talked to several Milwaukee area legislators as we continue this body of work to look at other municipal governments to try to determine, is this really mostly a bigger city problem, or is this across the board, an across the board municipal problem? I think we certainly want to engage legislators from across the state on that question to start seeing if we can come up with some answers.
Okay, and in the last minute or two that we have left, talking with Rob Henkin, President, Wisconsin Policy Forum, what else you working on this year? What kind of fun? I'm sorry, I'm the ultimate city nerd. I love this stuff. What else you have in the hopper?
Well, so, Jerry, we've obviously, the focus here has been on the revenue side. We're also very interested in the expenditure side, and we think that one of the real untapped opportunities on the expenditure side is service sharing and consolidation. Yep. And seeing municipal governments and county governments and school districts, for that matter, look at ways that they can share services and potentially undertake some functional consolidation. So, ironically, in the Racine area, we plan to be doing some work around service sharing possibilities around the range of services. We have an infrastructure series that is directly relevant to this conversation. So we have done a series of reports on local government infrastructure in greater Milwaukee. We've looked at local streets and roads and bridges, both in the city of Milwaukee and then county trunk highways and county bridges for Milwaukee County. We've looked at water and sewer infrastructure for city and for the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. We did a report on City of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County buildings things. We have another report coming out in the spring that's going to be looking at the parks and cultural institutions from the city of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County. And here too, our lens is these two big governments, City of Milwaukee, Milwaukee County, but we think a lot of the issues that are coming up in these reports are relevant to municipal and county governments throughout the state in terms of what's one of the first areas that suffers when local governments are facing financial stress. It's taking appropriate care of your infrastructure.
Yep.
It's something that hypothetically can be pushed back, though it shouldn't be pushed back. And so we're trying to really document what have been the consequences of actions like that in southeast Wisconsin.
And we are out of time. It sounds like we're going to have you back. Rob Henkin, president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum. I'm Jerry DeShane. Thank you for joining us for The Local Perspective.